In the old wars, men believed the sea was a boundary, an edge of the map where land troubles could not follow. They were wrong, because out beyond the surf, sometimes the ocean didn't merely watch a war. Sometimes it answered. In 1952, while the Korean peninsula ground itself into mud and wire, there moved offshore a shape that felt like it belonged to an earlier age, a time when steel was law and distance meant nothing. USS Wisconsin. They called her Wisky, the way sailors name a storm, half as a joke and half as a prayer. An Iowa-class battleship, one of the last great giants ever built. Long as a city block, heavy as a fortress, and carrying guns so large they didn't seem real until you stood beside them. 16-inch rifles. Not cannons, not guns, but rifles, because even at sea, this thing was designed to shoot with the cold precision of a marksman. Only the bullet was a slab of steel weighing more than a small car. Back then, on the ground, wars were fought hill by hill. At sea, Wisconsin fought by coordinates. She was naval gunfire support. Floating artillery for troops who couldn't see the enemy, only the ridgelines the enemy hid behind. When Marines and soldiers stalled on a slope, they called offshore, and the sea sent an answer that arrived faster than reinforcements. And when Wisconsin spoke, it didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like the sky had split its knuckles. Men miles inland felt it in their ribs. Windows trembled. Loose earth shivered. Even the air seemed to recoil, as if the world itself was stepping back to make room. But legends don't begin with the loud part. They begin with the mistake. Along the North Korean coast, an artillery battery watched the water and saw a silhouette where it shouldn't have been. The war had taught them to take every opportunity. They had a gun, they had a target, and the range felt possible. One round. A single 155mm shell, small by battleship standards, respectable by any other measure, sent out over gray water, cutting through salt wind and haze, arcing toward the biggest ship in the area. The gunners likely expected a clean hit, or at least a scare. What they didn't understand was the difference between striking a ship and waking one. The shell came down and slapped steel, not on the main armor belt, not near the great turrets, but against the shield of an old 40mm mount on the starboard side. It didn't sink the ship. It didn't cripple her. It didn't even dent the myth the way the enemy hoped. But it did what war always does. It found men. 3 sailors were wounded. Ordinary hands doing ordinary shipboard work. Men whose names wouldn't make a headline. Men who had no say in the moment that reached them out of the sky. And in that instant, the story could have ended as a footnote. Battleship struck by shore fire. Minor damage. But Wisconsin was not a footnote kind of ship. Here is what people get wrong when they retell it later. They say the battleship lost her temper. They say she fired back because her pride was scratched, because her paint was marked. That makes for a neat joke. It also misses the truth. What happened next was not a tantrum. It was procedure. A battleship is not a single weapon. It is an entire system built to take a target, solve it, and deliver an answer with absolute certainty. Below decks, the mood didn't become frantic. It became focused. On Wisconsin, there were men whose whole job was to turn the chaos of war into mathematics. They didn't need to see the battery with their own eyes. They needed bearings, range, wind, drift, and the calm discipline of training. The fire control teams went to work, the kind of work that looks like patience but is actually speed-dressed in order. They took reports from spotters. They refined the location. They ran the numbers through a system that felt almost antique even then. Gears, dials, and analog computation, the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, a mechanical brain that could predict where a target would be by the time a shell arrived. Above, on the weathered deck, the big turrets began to stir. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Thousands of tons shifting with a deep, grinding certainty. The barrels turned toward shore like a judge turning to face the accused. And inside those turrets, the ritual began. Men in helmets and hearing protection moved with practiced rhythm in cramped steel spaces. Shell hoists clanked. Powder bags were handled with reverence, like sacred items no one dared treat casually. Breeches opened. Chambers waited. A 16-inch gun doesn't load so much as it is fed. One massive shell lifted and guided. Then the powder, silk bags packed with propellant, stacked in a careful sequence. Then the breach sealed with a finality that sounded like a vault door. And all the while, there was no shouting, no panic, just the quiet, relentless certainty of a crew doing what a battleship crew was born to do. Out on the coast, the artillery battery likely kept working, nailing down their aim, preparing another shot, perhaps feeling the thrill of having struck the enemy at sea. If they paused at all, it might have been to listen, because the sea had gone strangely still. Not calm, wars don't allow calm, but attentive like a room holding its breath. Then, on Wisconsin, a light changed. A short call passed through a headset. A final check. A final number. A final correction to account for wind and distance and the spin of the Earth itself. The target was set. And now the difference between a field gun and a battleship would be measured. Not in anger, not in pride, but in one brutal fact of old war. Some answers are too large to misunderstand. The men in the turret waited for the command that would turn a coordinate into thunder. And when it came, the ocean would speak in a voice no hillside could ignore. The command did not come as a shout. It came the way it always does on a professional ship. Short, controlled, passed along like a seal pressed into wax. Fire. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the world broke its own silence. The first turret erupted with a concussion so heavy it felt less like sound and more like pressure made visible. A sheet of flame tore from the muzzle. The air around the barrels rippled as if struck. On deck, men braced by instinct even when they were ready, because no amount of training truly prepares the body for what 16 inches of naval rifle does to the atmosphere. And Wisconsin did not fire once. She fired the way a battleship fires, deliberate, repeating, relentless, as though the ship itself had been built to turn time into impacts. The shells were already on their way before the smoke cleared, lifting on an arc no I could follow for long. They climbed into cloud and haze, disappearing into the gray, leaving only the memory of their departure and the certainty of their arrival. Somewhere inland, spotters watched through binoculars and optics from positions that felt too small to matter in the presence of what they had just summoned. They did not see the shells. They watched the ridgeline where the battery was hidden, an unremarkable piece of coastline that, in a moment, would be made famous for the worst reason. In the turret, the crew was already moving again. A battleship's rhythm is cruel in its efficiency. Breeches opened. Hoists lifted. Men guided the next shell into place with practiced motions, treating each step with the calm seriousness of those who understand that mistakes here are unforgiving. Powder bags followed. The breach closed. The gun returned to readiness. The old wars were filled with machines that demanded respect. This was one of them. Seconds later, far beyond the horizon line of the ship, the first impacts landed. At first, it was only a faint report, distant, delayed, rolling back over the water like a storm answering itself. Then the spotters saw the shoreline jump. Not metaphorically. The earth kicked. Dirt and rock lifted into the air in tall, sudden columns. A hillside that had looked solid a breath ago seemed to cough and break. This is the part of the story people love to exaggerate. They say Wisconsin erased a mountain. What is true, and more than enough, is that a 16-inch shell does not simply strike. It arrives with momentum so immense that the ground responds like a bell being hit by a hammer. It throws debris not like shrapnel in a close fight, but like the planet itself shrugging under a blow. It breaks positions that were carefully hidden. It ruins the careful geometry of trenches and dugouts and rock cover. Not with drama, but with physics. A field gun can damage you. A battleship changes the terrain you're standing on. The battery on the coast had been built for a certain kind of war, a kind where the enemy came at you with trucks, infantry, perhaps aircraft. It was not built to argue with a fortress that floated. Wisconsin's second salvo followed. Another hammerstroke across the sea. Another arc. Another impact that told every nearby unit, in the most unmistakable language, that a line had been crossed. The absurdity was the point, because this wasn't simply about returning fire. It was about teaching a lesson so loud that it would travel farther than any shell. And on the bridge and in the plotting rooms, the men doing the calculations did not describe it as fury. They described it as correction. Coordinates refined, fall of shot adjusted, aim tightened until the area of uncertainty became a point. Out beyond Wisconsin's bow, another ship watched the spectacle unfold. USS Buck, an escort moving nearby, smaller, faster, built for a different job entirely. The men aboard Buck could see Wisconsin's turrets shift with their heavy grace. They could feel each concussion ripple over the water. And they could imagine better than anyone what that meant for whoever sat under the landing zones. When the last of Wisconsin's replies had been delivered, the sea settled into something like calm again, at least on the surface. Smoke drifted. The turrets eased back. The ship continued her patrol as if this had been another item on the day's list. But the moment had carved itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. On Buck, a signalman stepped to his position and raised a lamp toward the battleship. In another war, on another ocean, such signals carried romance. Messages between ships in the night, quiet acknowledgments between crews. This one carried humor sharpened into steel. The lamp blinked out 2 words. Temper. Temper. It was a joke, yes. But it was also a label. A way of naming the moment when a battleship had reminded the coastline what kind of power still existed offshore. A way of admitting, with a grin that could be heard even through code and light, that the response had been wildly, overwhelmingly disproportionate. And in the old wars, that kind of disproportion was a strategy, because the true target was never only the gun that fired. It was the mind behind it. The idea that said, we can strike and survive the reply. That idea did not survive. Wisconsin had been scratched, and the sea had answered with thunder that turned a hidden position into a place nobody would ever want to be again. For a while, the lesson held. Then time did what it always does. It moved on. Aircraft grew faster. Missiles grew smarter. Wars changed shape. The grand battleships, those ocean titans, began to feel like relics. Too expensive. Too visible. Too tied to an age when distance could be conquered by brute force alone. The world declared them obsolete. And for a moment, it looked like it was right. Wisconsin went quiet, a giant put back to sleep. But history has a habit of returning to old tools when it runs out of new answers. Decades later, another war would flare under a different sun, on a different shoreline, and the United States would wake the old giants again. Not because they were modern, but because they were undeniable. And in that later war, Wisconsin would not only fire. She would terrify without firing at all. Because by then, her reputation had become a weapon, one that could reach farther than her guns. And it would begin with something almost unbelievable. A small drone over an island, and men on the ground deciding that it was safer to surrender to the machine in the sky than to wait for the thunder offshore. Decades passed, and the world convinced itself that battleships were finished. The old giants were too large for modern oceans, too expensive for modern budgets, too slow for a century that worshipped speed. Missiles could strike farther. Aircraft could reach faster. Satellites could see everything. The era of steel titans, so the experts said, had ended. And for a time, USS Wisconsin rested in silence, a sleeping monument to an older kind of war. But history has a way of circling back. In 1991, the desert became the new coastline of fear. The Gulf War erupted under a different sky, with different weapons, different uniforms, and a battlefield defined not by trenches but by sensors and air power. Still, when it came time to send a message that could be felt in the bones, America reached back into the past and pulled the giants forward again. Wisconsin returned to war not as a museum piece, but as a contradiction. She carried modern weapons now. Cruise missiles in armored boxes, radios and electronics that belonged to a newer age. Yet her identity had not changed. She was still what she had always been, a floating promise that if you drew the wrong line in the sand, something larger than you could erase it. In the northern Gulf, there was a small piece of land called Failaka Island. On a map it looked harmless, just a low island near Kuwait, easy to overlook in a war filled with bigger names. But it mattered. Iraqi forces held positions there. They had dug in, watched the water, and waited for whatever might come. Offshore, the battleships waited too. And in the modern age, warfare had gained a strange new set of eyes. Unmanned aircraft, small buzzing drones, were now part of the battlefield. They did not carry a pilot. They did not speak. They simply watched, circling overhead like mechanical birds, feeding images to ships and commanders who could now see beyond the next ridge. One of these drones was the Pioneer. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't glamorous. It looked more like a model airplane than a weapon of the future. But it had one advantage that mattered more than appearance. It could hover above a position and make men feel exposed. On Failaka, Iraqi soldiers saw it first as a nuisance. Something in the sky that made a faint sound, a tiny presence compared to the roar of jets they had learned to fear. Then they remembered what it meant. Because in that war, those drones were not alone. They were eyes for something offshore, something the men on the island could not see, but could absolutely imagine. A battleship. A ship whose guns were not meant to fight in the ordinary sense, but to deliver certainty. Guns that could land destruction from beyond the horizon. Guns that did not need to win a duel, because there was no duel to be had. If the Pioneer circled above you, it meant you were being measured. It meant someone was refining your coordinates. It meant that somewhere out at sea, in a steel room lit by red lamps and instrument panels, a crew could already be adjusting for wind and distance, preparing to turn your hiding place into open ground. And on a small island, with nowhere to retreat and no cover that could truly protect against an impact of that scale, the mind starts doing the only math that matters. Not range, not caliber, survival. The drone made another pass. And then something happened that could only happen in a war where old monsters still existed. The Iraqi soldiers came out. They began waving white cloth. They raised their arms. They signaled surrender, not to a soldier face to face, not to a tank on the road, not even to an aircraft with a pilot inside. They surrendered to the drone. Because the drone wasn't the threat. The drone was the warning. It was a quiet reminder that the sea was watching, and the sea could speak in thunder. If the story feels unbelievable, that's because it sits right on the fault line between two eras. It's a moment when modern warfare, remote, electronic, almost invisible, collided with the oldest kind of fear, the fear of an unstoppable blow you can't outrun. In 1952, Wisconsin taught a coastline what it meant to wake a giant. In 1991, she proved something even more unsettling. Sometimes you don't need to fire a shot. Sometimes the reputation of the gun is enough. Sometimes the shadow of a battleship beyond the horizon becomes a weapon in its own right, strong enough to bend decisions, to empty trenches, to make men choose surrender over the possibility of thunder. That is why Wisconsin became legend. Not just because she could destroy what she hit, but because, long after the world declared her obsolete, she could still change the outcome of a moment simply by being present. Today, she sits in Norfolk, Virginia, no longer a warship in motion but a museum. Steel and history preserved in place. You can walk her decks and stand beside the turrets and look up at those barrels and feel, in a way no photograph can teach, how small a person is beside the machinery of an older war. And if you listen, really listen, you might imagine it. The slow grind of turret motors, the clank of hoists, the final, quiet click of readiness. Then the ocean's answer. If you want more stories where history isn't just remembered, but felt, where the past rises up in steel and thunder, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next documentary. And tell me in the comments, if you were on that coastline in 1952 and you heard the first 16-inch salvo leave the horizon, what would you do? Because some warnings don't come twice. They come once. And the sea remembers.